We're going to finish up this week's lecture by talking about later developments in genetic research as well as sex-linked genetic traits. Later on, something developed called Sutton's hypothesis. Actually, Mendel had no idea how the traits were passed. In other words, he had no idea about chromosomes or chromosome theory or any of that. And the person that developed the idea that chromosomes were actually the source of genetic translation and transfer was a person named Sutton, and it was called Sutton's hypothesis. And then, as it turns out, one of the 23 chromosomes in humans are separated off and called sex chromosomes. And what that means is that it determines the sex of the organism, either male or female. Anything carried on that same chromosome is also called sex-linked because it travels with the sex of the organism. So, for example, here we have the typical situation where two X chromosomes represent a female, X and a Y represents a male, and these are the only chromosomes that are not actual identical pairs. The Y is significantly different than the X in the male. And if you combine, you end up with the following situation where two of the offspring will be female and two of the offspring will be male. Now, let's say, for example, that this trait is carried on the X chromosome, and both the female chromosomes have this trait, whatever R represents. Then all the offspring will get an X from mom, and in the women, in the females, you'll have one W and one R. And if R happens to be the dominant trait, then all the females will express R. And because all the males get R as well with no opposing W, they will also all express R. And as it says up here, the R represents red eyes and W represents white eyes. And so the females, if the R is a dominant, then the females will be red-eyed, and the males will be red-eyed. If the W is dominant, then the females will have white eyes, and the males will have red eyes. So 50% are hybrid, and it turns out that the red is dominant. So 50% are hybrid females with red eyes, and 50% are males with red eyes. So, as I said, sex-linked means that the trait travels on the sex chromosome is expressed with the sex of the organism. So here we have a hybrid red-eyed female crossed with a red-eyed male, and you end up with a red-eyed female, homozygous red-eyed female, a red-eyed male, a heterozygous red-eyed female, and a white-eyed male. So 25% would be homozygous red-eyed females, 25% would be hybrid red-eyed females, 25% would be red-eyed males, and 25% would be white-eyed males. 75% of the offspring would have red eyes. Now in humans, there are various genetic traits that are carried either on the sex chromosomes or on other chromosomes. This is an interesting trait known as polydactyly. In case you hadn't noticed, this child has 6 fingers on each hand. And we talk about how frequent this kind of thing will happen, and that's called allelic frequency. So how often allelic frequency is how often the gene exists in the population. And if an individual has the allele, but the allele is not in the phenotype, is not expressed, then the individual is called a carrier. An example of a carrier state is cystic fibrosis, which is a lung disease that causes severe problems in the people who inherit it. Now, there's a lot of traits in human genetics that are a little bit different. One is called codominant, which means that each version of the allele is expressed equally. So, for example, in hemoglobin, most people have what's known as AA. The A comes from the word accelerate, which is the hemoglobin moves quickly through a gel when being separated. And so the normal is a homozygous A. Again, we talked about incomplete dominance in the past. It's a mixing or a blending of phenotypes based on the heterozygous situation. Now, this also happens with codominant traits, such that sometimes when there's a codominance, the resulting phenotype is a mix between the two. And this actually happens with hemoglobin, because the hemoglobin of a carrier, or an SA, as we'll talk about in a second, is abnormal, but it's still able to perform the function of normal hemoglobin. So sickle cell anemia is a situation where someone inherits both S's, and S stands for slow. So if an individual has two S's, so it's homozygous S, they have the disease, sickle cell anemia, normal being two A's. The carrier, or sickle cell trait, the person has an A and an S. Now, this happens not only to be codominant, but also incompletely dominant, because if the person is stressed in some way, they could develop symptoms of a sickle cell individual. Sickle cell trait individuals frequently are sensitive to high altitudes and low oxygen in the environment. And so if they go to a high altitude, they will act like they actually have the disease when they don't actually have the disease. They're just a carrier. There's a guy named Ryan Clark who played football for the Pittsburgh Steelers, who's a AS or hybrid sickle cell trait individual, and he went to Denver to play a football game and developed sickle cell symptoms, and it was caused by the fact that his codominant A and S were expressed in an incomplete fashion, and so when he was stressed, his hemoglobin sickled like a sickle cell patient. Multiple allelic inheritance just means that there are more than one possible trait. So instead of tall versus short or white versus black, you can have three options. You might have tall, medium, and short. You might have white, red, and yellow, something like that. The common example in humans is the ABO blood type, where there's three different possibilities. There's the A possibility, the B possibility, or the neither possibility. And these people have four phenotypes that can be expressed. If they have both, if they're homozygous for neither, then they're blood type O. If they're heterozygous or homozygous for A, they have blood type A. If they're heterozygous or homozygous for B, then they have blood type B. And if they're heterozygous for A and B, then they have the blood type AB. And this is the example of multiple genetic inheritance. Another thing that happens in humans is the fact that genes can sometimes impact more than one seemingly unrelated traits. And then there's also a situation where traits are controlled by multiple different genes. So the eye color or well, we won't say blood type, but eye color or hair color may not just be one specific gene, but there may be several genes that contribute to that phenotype. Now, there are sex-linked diseases, and the most famous that you'll hear about is hemophilia. Hemophilia is a clotting disorder that occurs because there is a lack of a protein that is necessary for blood to clot. So it is a recessive abnormal allele, and it is carried on the X chromosome. Because it's carried on the X chromosome, the males are much more likely to express the trait or the phenotype. So let's take a look at how this happens. You have a woman who is a heterozygous for hemophilia, so she's a carrier. The little h is a carrier. You have a normal male. So phenotypically, both these people are normal. Both of them have normal blood clotting. There's no reason to think there's any problem. But they have a series of children. They produce a female carrier, no problem. They produce a male with hemophilia, that's a problem. And then they produce 2 normal children. This male is going to have to take clotting factors his whole life in order to live to adulthood. And this woman will become a carrier, and she could potentially pass hemophilia to her male offspring when she gets married. So 25% are carriers, 25% are normal females, 25% normal males, and 25% have hemophilia. 75% appear normal. Another sex-linked trait is colorblindness. And you can see here again, just like hemophilia, a mix between a normal non-colorblind father and a carrier mother produces 1 colorblind male child and 3 normal appearing male children, although one of the women is a carrier. We'll finish with what's known as a pedigree chart. A pedigree chart is a way of demonstrating the inheritance of people in a family line. We use these in medicine to look at the inheritance of certain diseases in certain situations. The nomenclature is written on the side here, which is a square represents the male, a circle represents the females, a light-colored square represents an unaffected male, a bivalve or two-tone circle represents a carrier female, and you can see you have 1 affected male, which this could be the hemophiliac or could be the colorblind. This is a normal female, this is a normal male, and this is a carrier female. And this is known as a pedigree, looking at the phenotypes.